Alright, today we're going to be talking, guys, we're going to be talking about the Fugitive Slave Act, okay? What compromise did we talk about yesterday that we talked about, we mentioned the Fugitive Slave Act?
The compromise of 1850.
Okay. Raise your hand, we're going to be sharing, okay? The compromise of, yes, of 1850. And why was that compromise, what happened in that compromise? Let's review what we learned yesterday. Raise your hand if you want to share. Yes, Austin?
Texas got $10 million for land in New Mexico and Utah.
Territory.
Thanksgiving.
Okay, right. And Nathan, what else?
California went to the free states, and in Washington D.C. you can't trade and you can't like buy, sell, and stuff slaves, but you can hold them there. And you can't live there.
You can like visit. Okay, right. Yes, Austin?
Utah and New Mexico are slave states.
They're not slave states yet. They're not. They're territories, right? Okay. Yes, they're open up states. Good job, guys. You guys learned quite a bit yesterday. I'm glad you guys actually remembered. We're going to be talking about the Fugitive Slave Act in more detail today. We are spending a lot of time on this today because this is this is the topic that your free write will be on for this unit. Okay. So that's why we want to spend so much time and really have you guys really think deeply about this topic. All right. So I just want to give you some general information about it. It was passed as part, like we talked about, the Compromise of 1850 between the North and the South. And the reason I say it succeeded is because it kept the nation together for the time being. For the time being. And what that means is the North and the South had a lot of disagreements, right? About slavery was the main one. And this compromise kept them together for a little bit longer. And as we've learned, this is a process. This whole unit, different things are happening that are kind of adding or kind of trying to neutralize this problem of slavery and how the nation is going to remain together or separate, and how we're gonna approach it, how we're gonna change things. Okay, so the most controversial act. This is the most controversial thing that happened in the Compromise of 1850 as well. And the abolitionists nicknamed it the Bloodhound Law. Now, what does that mean? Why would it be called that? Why would they call it that?
Because they're searching out for slaves.
They are. What are they using to search for slaves?
Bloodhounds.
They're using bloodhounds, right? They are using bloodhounds to search for fugitive slaves. So a lot of people in the North and abolitionists use that for an explanation of what this law would be. All right, the Fugitive Slave Act declared that all runaway slaves should be returned to their master upon capture. That means if they're found in the North, they should be returned to their master no matter what. And that all citizens, as well as police officers and anyone, is responsible for returning those slaves. They are responsible for that. And they require citizens to assist in the recovery of the fugitive slaves. And that would mean if they did not comply, that they would be imprisoned or be fined because of that. So there was some consequences. Before, you were supposed to return slaves, right? You're supposed to help with the recovery of fugitive slaves. But if that didn't happen, there really was no strict law enforcing that and kind of punishing you if you didn't obey. So this is the change that really occurred. There was punishments for all people that did not comply with this law, okay? And if you captured a runaway, they could not testify in their defense. They could not say what really happened or give an explanation of what went on. They also were not given the right of a court trial by jury. That means that the only person that really decide their fate would be a commissioner. These commissioners, if you read this bottom bullet here, what would maybe kind of make them biased? Biased, or maybe, yeah? Andrew?
After runaways cannot testify on his own behalf.
Right, but the commissioners, how much would they get paid? How did their payment differ?
Like $100.
Commissioners.
Okay, it says right there, guys. Just read it.
All fugitive was released $10 if he or she were sent away with that claim.
The claimant would be the slave owner. The claimant would be the person that would be claiming that fugitive slave as their own. So if the commissioner says that they believe that this fugitive slave belongs to this claimant, they get paid $10. However, if they disagree and say that release the slave, as a free man or saying that this is not the right claimant or whatever happens, they get paid $5. Can you see how this might kind of turn into a little bit of corruption because of this, right? Okay. All right. The Act also called for changes in filing for a claim, which made the process a lot easier. If someone steals your car, or someone steals your phone, or someone steals anything from you, breaks into your house, what do you have to do with the police?
Call them.
Call them and
File a police report.
you have to file a claim, right? File a claim for your lost or stolen property. And that's what this is. This made these claims for fugitive slaves a lot easier to file for slave owners. So that made the whole process a whole lot easier. Also, it made more federal officials responsible for enforcing the law. So before, again, not everyone had to follow the law. Not everyone. There was no strong consequences for not following the law. But now they are officially and especially responsible for returning fugitive slaves. And it was never like that before. So this really is a change in that culture. And they would be fined for being lax. If they were like, oh, you know, you're a fugitive slave, I'm going to kind of turn the other way and not turn you in, they could be fined. Even as a police officer, fined as helping the slave. Okay? So, and lastly, there's no statute of limitations that apply. Even slaves that have been freed for maybe 10 or 15 years, or maybe their whole life, they might be returned back to slavery, even though they have been free for 10 or 15 years. And that might be they ran away and they actually just changed their name maybe, or changed the way of their life, and they just had established a life for themselves in the North. Or on the other side, it might be that maybe their slave owner died and they were freed because of that. Or lastly, maybe they just were freed by their slave owner. But this kind of makes it more difficult because they can't testify, right? They can't share what actually happened. So it's really up to what the commissioner decides. So that's something to keep in mind here. All right, the slave view. We're going to be talking about several different perspectives, right? So I want you guys to think about how would the slaves think about this? The slaves that are actually in the South. When they hear about this Fugitive Slave Act, what might be some feelings or some thoughts that might come to mind? Casey?
They don't want to run away.
Maybe they've thought about running away before, and yeah, they just don't want to run away. They don't want to risk that. They don't want to risk having to be returned back to their old way of life. Right. Nathan?
Depression, because now, like, it's said that they'd have to get all the way to Canada to be freed.
Right. It was always the idea that Canada was the ultimate goal, but a lot of times runaway slaves would stay in a northern state instead and build a life for themselves there. Did you have something else to say, Izzy? Okay. Any other things? Yes, Casey?
The northern slaves.
The what?
Northern slaves to Canada.
Right. The slaves that maybe be living in the northern states maybe would have to now pick up and move, right? When we talk about free slaves, yeah, that's definitely something to consider. All right, the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad became more active during these 10 years than it ever was before. Okay, this was more active. There's 20,000 slaves that actually moved to Canada during this time. And so that's kind of interesting when you think about that, because although this law is more strict, boys, although this law is more strict than it ever has been before, more slaves are escaping into Canada than ever before. So that's kind of interesting. These pictures that you see here are fugitive slave posters. They're the reward posters, right? So $500 reward, $100 reward, and later on in this activity, you'll have an opportunity to make your own poster that's similar to one of these that you see up here, okay? All right. The Free African American View, yes?
Okay, so you said we're making a poster, right?
I'll explain the activity when we get there, okay? But, yeah, one of the parts of the activity, you have an option to make a poster, yes. All right, so the Free African American View of the Fugitive Slave Act. FSA, that's what that stands for, guys, the Fugitive Slave Act. That's just an abbreviation of that. All right, so for free slaves that lived in the North already, a lot of times this meant that they just decided to pick up and move to Canada. They didn't want to have to worry about possibly being taken captive and put in a prison cell and maybe possibly having to go back to jail, back to the South into slavery. A lot of times when you were suspected for being a runaway slave or for being a fugitive slave, you would be put in a jail cell and kept there until they kind of determined whether or not you would be returned back to slavery or if you were actually a free slave or not. And obviously, most times it probably would mean that you would be put back into slavery in the South. All right, many left their homes and fled to Canada, left everything behind. Some, however, did decide to stay in one of the northern states and just kind of lay low. Just not make any racket, just kind of stay under the radar and not really make a spectacle of themselves and just really become very, almost invisible. All right, the free blacks too were also captured and sent back to the South, and this is something we mentioned already several times. Free slaves were captured, and for many different reasons. And like I talked about, there's lots of different ways that slaves can be freed, but just because they're free doesn't mean maybe they could still be sent back to the South. It just depends on the situation, and there, of course, there are going to be a lot of corruption going on too. So, all right, with no legal rights like we talked about, they had no way to plead their own cases. So, of course, they were sent back to slavery because there was no way to plead their cases and tell the truth about what really is going on here. All right, so this is the Southern Slave Owner view of the Fugitive Slave Act. You can see here in this poster, I just want to read it really quick for you. Caution colored people of Boston, one and all. You are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with watchmen and police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers. How might slave owners feel in the South about a poster like this being found in the North? How might they feel about that? Caitlin?
It would kind of be mad because that poster's just telling the colored people to just hide.
Right, they might, because it's a kind of a warning to let them know. But how about that support? What about the support that they're finally getting in returning their runaway slaves? That was never like an option before. They never really had that support and that support system in the North. They were always just like, once they got to the North, it was almost impossible to maybe find them sometimes. But because of this support of the police officers and the watchmen, they are going to be able to find their slaves a lot easier than they ever would have been before. So they finally are receiving this support, like I had already mentioned, and like we talked about earlier as well, it's easier to file a claim, much easier than it ever had been before. All right, bounty hunters. You guys all know Dog the bounty hunter and what he does, right? Okay, so bounty hunters are, well, they really weren't ever needed before this time. Of course, there would always be fugitives from the law running away, and there might be, warrants out for their arrest, or there might be awards for finding them. But there was never such a need as there was now. There's so many fugitive slaves. You saw those posters. There's hundreds and thousands and just tons. They would be seen everywhere, all over the cities in the North and in the South, because they tried to catch the fugitive slaves before they even left the South or even the States. So they really put these posters everywhere. They would be seen everywhere. All right, and the slave catchers or the bounty hunters, they would either be hired by the slave owner to find maybe one or two specific slaves that they were exactly looking for, or maybe they just generally went out and wanted to make money by finding fugitive slaves in the North or in the South, depending on which one it was. But really, this job had never really happened before. This is the first time you would really see this on the widespread scale, okay? And they, like I said, they might just be hired or just generally be looking for fugitive slaves. And this was a way that you could make a living. You could quit your job and do this for a living and make enough money to support yourself, or if you had a family, to live off of. So this is a big change in the way that we see this. All right, now the abolitionist view. Now the abolitionists were people that lived in the North mostly that wanted to abolish slavery, right? So how would this make them feel? As the picture says, after this poster say, how would they feel? Upset, outraged, as this says. Outraged fellow citizen and abolitionist meeting this evening. And then on the bottom it says, the Union forever. The North wanted to keep the Union united, right? The Union is the United States. They wanted to keep the United States united, the North and the South. And that is exactly what this poster is saying. All right, thank you. All the more determined to put an end to slavery. Abolitionists This enraged them. They wanted to put an end to slavery more than ever at this time. As well as people that maybe never thought about slavery before. They always knew about it, but it was kind of on the down low and no one really talked about it that much. This finally made it huge, just made it on the wide, all across the nation they were talking about that. And we're talking about this Fugitive Slave Act and whether or not they supported it, what should be done about it, if it's constitutional, is this something that we really should be doing? They were talking about it. And people that weren't really sure about the way they felt about slavery, this is the first time they really had to take a stand on if they were for or against slavery and how they really felt about it, okay? So this is the first time this is on everyone's mind and everyone's talking about. This would be all across the newspapers and everyone would be talking about it during this time. Whether or not they would follow it or if they would kind of just ignore it entirely and continue working to free the slaves, it was really up to that person, and that was a big decision that you had to make. All right, I think that is all we have. Greg, can you get up and please go turn the light on for me, please? Thank you. We are going to be doing an activity. Thank you. That is tic-tac-toe.